Bastogne, Belgium, December 1944. The town sits in a pocket of snow and Wehrmacht artillery, surrounded, cut off, waiting for relief that may never come. Captain James Harrow has been a field surgeon for 18 months, long enough to know that triage means choosing who lives and who gets morphine. But the cold is a different kind of killer. It arrives quietly in fingers and toes, turns flesh white and then black, and demands amputation before infection takes the whole limb. The standard treatment is amputation. It always has been. Military protocol, hospital doctrine, every textbook Harrow studied before the war, all of it agrees. Frostbite tissue dies, dead tissue must be removed. Whole companies are losing men not to German fire, but to gangrene and shock from unnecessary amputations. The supply lines are down, plasma is rationed, and outside the aid station walls, soldiers in damp foxholes are burying their fingers in the snow, knowing what's coming. Harrow has read the forbidden paper, a European case study on rapid rewarming that contradicts everything his training taught him. It came through a Red Cross shipment marked for reference only, not approved, not sanctioned, not part of the Medical Corps protocol, but in the basement of a seized schoolhouse with 200 men showing signs of cold injury and only 2 surgical teams, Harrow must choose between following orders and saving hands that deserve to stay attached to living men. The Wehrmacht doesn't care which choice he makes, neither does the cold. But the officer commanding the field hospital, Colonel Vance, a man who has never held a scalpel but has held plenty of regulations, has made his position clear: amputate or face court-martial for dereliction. Harrow has 4 days before the pressure becomes unbearable. 4 days before he must decide whether a surgeon serves the law or serves the body in front of him. Chapter 1. The siege has no sound. The cold doesn't announce itself with noise. It arrives in silence, the kind that follows the artillery stops when the guns grow quiet and only the wind remembers there's a war happening. Captain James Harrow first noticed it at 0300 hours when Private Coleman stumbled into the aid station, his fingers blue-black at the tips, the skin splitting like rotten fruit. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, didn't cry. He just looked down at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. "How long?" Harrow asked, already knowing the answer. "Since yesterday morning, sir. They went numb around noon. I didn't want to report it. The platoon needed me on the line." Harrow had heard this story 40 times in 4 days. Soldiers didn't report frostbite because reporting meant evacuation, and evacuation was impossible. The siege had tightened. The Germans surrounded Bastogne on 3 sides. Relief was promised, but not arriving. Supply convoys didn't exist anymore. Only ammunition and plasma came through the perimeter when anything came at all. Everything else, including evacuation routes, had collapsed into rumor and prayer. "Get him to the warming station," Harrow told the orderly, Sergeant Mills. "Gradual rewarming, 37 degrees, no friction. We'll reassess in 6 hours. But he knew what he'd see in 6 hours. The tissue would continue to die. The line between viable and gangrenous would creep upward. And by tomorrow, Coleman would be on the surgical table, watching his own fingers disappear into a metal basin while Harrow's saw moved steadily through bone. The basement of the schoolhouse was converted into the field hospital. 2 operating tables, a sterilization area cramped into a storage closet, and a recovery ward that smelled like metal, iodine, and something else, the sweet rot of infected tissue that wasn't quite dead enough to stop fighting the body's immune system. The walls were stone, cold to the touch, even in daylight. The single heating system had stopped working 2 days ago. No one had time to fix it. Colonel Vance occupied the office upstairs, a wood stove office with coffee he somehow still obtained, a desk covered in reports, and the exhausted authority of a man trying to manage an impossible siege with insufficient supplies and the constant knowledge that someone was going to die because of his decisions. He'd already decided which deaths mattered. Amputations saved lives. That was the doctrine. Infection was worse than losing a hand. That was the math. Harrow didn't disagree with the math. He disagreed with the premise. Private Coleman's files arrived at the operating table at 0900 hours. Harrow read the summary. Frostbite affecting fingers 2 through 5, right hand, advancing line of demarcation, gangrenous potential significant, recommendation. Amputation at the metacarpal joint, minimum. Harrow looked at the boy's hand. The blackened tissue was real. The threat was real. The standard procedure was real. And somewhere inside the regulation and the textbook and the military order was a young man who would spend the rest of his life reaching for something he could no longer feel. Mills handed him the surgical saw. It was small, built for precision work. It moved easily through bone. But Harrow didn't pick it up. Not yet. "How long until he wakes?" Harrow asked Mills, already knowing the anesthesia had been administered, already knowing the hand was cleaned and draped, already knowing that every second he hesitated was a second of wasted resources in a hospital running on fumes. 20 minutes, sir. Maybe less. The ether supply is low." Harrow set down his instruments. Something in his chest, maybe conscience, maybe fatigue, maybe the accumulated weight of 40 amputations in 4 days, had shifted. He walked upstairs without another word, leaving Mills standing in the operating theatre with Coleman's hand waiting. Chapter 2. The Order Stands. Colonel Vance didn't look up from his reports when Harrow entered. The office was warm, the wood stove had been rebuilt, and Vance had the luxury of comfort that only a command officer could extract from a siege. His uniform was clean, his coffee was hot, his hands weren't blue. "Sir, I need to discuss Protocol 447 for cold injury management." "No," Vance said, turning a page. "You haven't heard the question." "I don't need to. I know what you're going to ask, and the answer is no. Every Corps hospital from here to Paris is following amputation protocol. It's proven, it's safe, it's done." Harrow waited. Vance finally looked up, expecting dismissal, finding a captain who wasn't moving. "There's evidence from European research." "There's doctrine," Vance interrupted. "And doctrine is what keeps us from guessing our way into a mass casualty event. You're a surgeon, Harrow. You follow protocol. You don't experiment on enlisted men." "I'm not suggesting experimentation. I'm suggesting we reconsider. Consider this. If your treatment fails, if a man develops gas gangrene, if infection reaches the bloodstream and he dies on your watch because you decided military medicine wasn't good enough for you, what then? Who takes responsibility? You or me?" Harrow knew the answer. They both knew it. "The protocol is amputation," Vance continued. "You'll proceed with Coleman and every other case that comes through that door. Are we clear?" The phrase was dismissal and command, fused into one. Harrow had received it 100 times in 100 different ways throughout his military service. But this time, standing in a warm room while men froze in foxholes, something in the order felt less like protocol and more like permission to amputate faster. He turned to leave. "Harrow," Vance said. The captain stopped. "I know you think you can do better. You're a good surgeon, but good surgeons follow orders. That's what keeps the system functioning. You want to save all the fingers, you want to play hero, that's not medicine. That's ego." Harrow left without answering. He walked downstairs to the operating theatre where Mills was waiting and Coleman was beginning to wake. The saw was in his hand again. He looked at the boy's fingers one more time. The living tissue beneath the blackened surface, the potential underneath the protocol, and made a choice that would define whether he was a surgeon or a soldier first. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Method. 3 days into the siege, Harrow found the paper in a shipment of Red Cross medical journals, its spine worn from being read in other hospitals, its margins filled with handwritten notes in languages he couldn't identify. The title was in German, "Über die schnelle Wiedererwärmung bei Erfrierungen," on rapid rewarming in frostbite cases. The author was a Vienna surgeon named Steinberg. The methodology was straightforward. Instead of gradual rewarming, Steinberg had immersed frostbitten tissue in water, heated to 42 degrees Celsius, hot enough to restart circulation rapidly, cold enough to avoid thermal shock. The tissue was given time to declare itself dead or alive. When the demarcation line became clear, truly clear, not assumed, then amputation could be precise, minimal, and certain. The results were radical. In a study of 247 cases, only 31 required amputation beyond the initial damaged tissue. The rest preserved function. Fingers remained attached. But the paper was marked Forschung, kein Standard, research, not standard, not approved, not adopted, not part of the medical consensus that had already decided what happened to cold tissue. Harrow read it 3 times that night, sitting in the basement office with cold coffee and the knowledge that somewhere above him soldiers were developing gangrene that the protocol insisted they develop. He thought about Coleman, whose right hand now ended at the wrist. He thought about the 23 amputations since then, each one following the order to amputate before certainty. And he thought about the 3 days remaining before the planned German assault pushed through the perimeter, or relief finally arrived, or the siege collapsed into something worse than siege. Mills found him at 0400 hours, reading by lamplight. "Sir, you should rest." "How many cases of frostbite are we expecting?" Harrow asked, not looking up. "At minimum rate. 200 more before the cold breaks. At worst rate, more than the hospital can handle." "And if we continue with standard amputation protocol?" Mills didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the mathematics. 200 cases meant 200 amputations if the protocol held. That meant 200 men with fewer fingers, fewer hands, fewer ways to hold a future after the war ended. "There's another method," Harrow said. "European research, rapid rewarming, immersion in warm water until the demarcation line is clear." "That's not approved." "No, it isn't." Mills sat down. "Colonel Vance will court-martial you. If it fails, yes. When he finds out you're using an unapproved protocol." "If we do this," Harrow said, finally looking at the sergeant, "we tell no one. We document nothing outside of standard reports. We watch every case, and if there's any sign of complications, we stop immediately and revert to amputation." "You're asking me to help you disobey a direct order?" "I'm asking you to help me save fingers that the protocol has already decided are dead. The protocol is wrong, Mills. It's wrong, and we both know it." Mills stood and walked to the door. Harrow thought he'd refuse, thought the chain of command would hold as it always did. But Mills turned back and said only one thing. "When does the first case arrive?" "CTA, embedded." If this story feels real to you, if you understand what Harrow faces in that moment, duty versus conscience, tell us in the comments, what would you have done in his place? Chapter 4. The first violation. The next frostbite case arrived at 0630 hours. Private Daniel Kowalski, 21 years old, from Chicago, with fingers so numb he couldn't feel the medic's touch. The tissue was white at the tips, red and swollen beneath, still early enough that the demarcation line hadn't become absolute. Harrow sent the surgical team to breakfast. "Coleman needs documentation for his discharge," he told Mills. "Take the orderlies, get everything processed. I'll begin the initial assessment on Kowalski." Mills understood. Within 5 minutes, the basement was quiet except for the sound of Harrow's footsteps and Kowalski's shallow breathing. The basin of water was heated to exactly 45 degrees. Harrow had tested it 3 times with a thermometer he'd found in the chemistry section of the schoolhouse. He immersed Kowalski's hands carefully, watching the tissue respond, waiting for the blood to return. The process took 40 minutes. Harrow's hands were steady, but his mind was running calculations. If this failed, if the tissue deteriorated further, if infection set in, Kowalski would be worse off than if Harrow had followed protocol. If it succeeded, if the fingers declared themselves viable, then Harrow would have proven that the forbidden method worked, and that every amputation following protocol had been unnecessary mutilation. The tissue began to pink. Color returned to the fingertips. Kowalski's fingers twitched involuntarily as the nerves began to fire again. It was working. By the time Mills returned with the orderlies, Kowalski's hands were wrapped in dry gauze, and Harrow was documenting the case as conservative immersion rewarming protocol, pending evaluation. Not standard, not forbidden, simply pending. "How many times can we do this before someone notices?" Mills asked quietly. "Not long," Harrow said, "but long enough to prove it works. Or long enough to fail catastrophically. Either way, the silence won't hold more than a week." Over the next 4 days, 17 cases arrived. Harrow treated them all the same way: warm water immersion, careful observation, time allowed for the demarcation line to declare itself honestly instead of being assumed. He documented nothing that would alert Colonel Vance. He moved quickly between cases, using equipment from the basement, working when the other surgeons were occupied with trauma and infection management elsewhere in the hospital. 14 of the 17 cases showed significant tissue recovery. 2 required partial amputation at the fingertip, a single phalanx instead of an entire hand. 1 case deteriorated despite the treatment, and Harrow made the decision himself to amputate, moving quickly, following protocol when his method had failed. Private Kowalski reported no infection. His fingers retained sensation. He could flex them within 3 days. Chapter 5. The surface cracks. The first sign that the silence was breaking came on day 6, when Captain Eleanor Reed, the hospital's chief nurse, found Harrow in the basement. She was holding Kowalski's chart. "Standard amputation protocol says his hand should have been removed," she said, not looking at him, "but it's still attached, and there's no documentation of why." Harrow didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't make her complicit. 15 other cases, she continued, all frostbite, all showing unusual tissue recovery, all missing the standard surgical notation. "Harrow, what are you doing?" "Trying to keep men from losing fingers they don't have to lose. By violating protocol, by questioning whether protocol is right." Reed set the chart down on the desk. She was 48 years old, had worked military hospitals since before Harrow enlisted, and had seen enough good intentions turn into disaster to be careful with her words. "If Vance finds out—" "He will," Harrow said. "I know he will. And when he does, I need you to document everything, every case, every treatment, every successful outcome. If he court-martials me, I want the evidence clear. You're asking me to choose between my career and your conviction. I'm asking you to do what you already know is right." Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then she began writing, and Harrow understood that she'd already made her choice before she came downstairs. By the 8th day, Colonel Vance discovered the discrepancy. He came to the basement with 3 pages of charts, his uniform crisp as anger, his voice controlled in the way that precedes explosion. 32 cases of frostbite treated outside protocol, he said, using an unauthorized methodology, with 0 documentation justifying deviation from standard procedure. "Every case succeeded or failed on its own merit," Harrow replied. "The tissue declared itself honestly. We preserved what was viable. We removed what was genuinely dead. You removed nothing when protocol demanded removal. You made a choice to disobey a direct order. I made a choice to question whether the order was correct." "Those are the same thing," Vance said. "And the answer is court-martial. You're relieved of surgical duty effective immediately. You'll stand before a formal review board when we reach a jurisdiction that can convene one. Until then, you'll remain in custody and—" "Sir," Reed interrupted from the doorway. "May I present data?" Vance turned, irritation shifting toward fury at the interruption. Reed held out a document she'd compiled overnight. 32 cases, outcomes, tissue recovery measurements, infection rates compared against standard amputation outcomes from other field hospitals. Captain Harrow's protocol preserved 29 viable hands, Reed said quietly. Standard amputation would have resulted in 29 amputations based on the initial tissue condition. The data suggests his methodology is superior. Vance took the document and read it twice. His jaw worked silently. Then he looked at Harrow with something that wasn't quite rage anymore. It was something more complicated, more dangerous. The recognition that authority had been questioned and the questioner had evidence. "You think you're better than the system," Vance said. "You think your judgment supersedes doctrine." "I think the doctrine was written for conditions that don't apply here," Harrow replied. "And I think 30 men with intact fingers will prove that." Chapter 6. The Turning Point. The Wehrmacht assault began at dawn on the 10th day, not from outside the perimeter, but as a gesture, a probing attack that meant the siege was entering its final phase. Relief was confirmed to be arriving within 36 hours. The window was closing. Winter was breaking. And in the chaos of potential breakthrough, Colonel Vance's authority began to fracture. The assault didn't reach the hospital, but the wounded came in waves. 78 trauma cases, 3 of them requiring emergency amputation for crush wounds and arterial damage. Genuine amputations, undeniable ones. The surgical teams worked for 14 hours straight. Harrow wasn't relieved of duty. He was too needed. Halfway through the 12th hour, a shell hit the building's east wing. The damage was controlled, but it forced an evacuation of the recovery ward. Patients were moved to the basement schoolhouse where Harrow was still operating. And that's when Private Coleman arrived, with a fever and a bandaged stump. The amputation site was infected. Gangrenous tissue was spreading up the forearm. His temperature was 104 degrees. He would likely lose the arm if the infection wasn't arrested immediately. And his chart read, "Amputation performed per protocol by Captain James Harrow, Day 3 of siege." Coleman was lying on a stretcher, barely conscious from infection fever, and his presence in the basement was a statement. This man's arm was amputated because protocol demanded it. And now, protocol demanded he might die. Harrow made a decision that went beyond disobedience. He made a decision that might constitute murder if it failed. He performed a radical debridement, removing not just the infected tissue, but the entire surgical site, going back beyond the original amputation line to healthy tissue. He took the hand that Coleman had lost, essentially removing the evidence of the original decision, and replaced it with clean tissue and the possibility that Coleman's arm might survive. It was butchery. It was surgery. It was impossible to distinguish between them. When he finished, Harrow walked to Colonel Vance's office and found him asleep at his desk, exhausted from the night's casualties. "Sir," Harrow said, "Private Coleman is septic. I've performed emergency debridement. He may recover his arm." Vance woke slowly, taking a moment to understand context. "That's not protocol." "No, sir, it isn't. And neither was my original amputation if I had followed your order to amputate blindly. Coleman's current infection exists because protocol said his fingers were dead before we allowed the demarcation line to declare itself. I was wrong to follow you. I'm trying to be less wrong now." Vance stood. For a moment, Harrow thought he would order him arrested. Instead, Vance walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered town. "How many of the 32 still have viable hands?" he asked quietly. "All of them. No infections, no complications. And Coleman will probably keep his arm." "Probably." Vance turned back to Harrow. His face had aged in the past 10 days, the lines deeper, the authority worn to something more fragile and honest. "I'm not going to court-martial you," he said. "Relief is arriving in 12 hours. When it does, You're going to submit a formal report documenting your methodology, and then you're going to let the medical corps decide whether you were right or whether you were a criminal. Can you accept that? Yes, sir. Because I don't know, Vance continued. I don't know if you saved lives or if you were arrogant enough to think you knew better than doctrine. But I know that Coleman's arm is still attached, and 29 other men have fingers, and maybe that's worth the risk of being wrong. CTA, embedded. If this battle still echoes in your mind, hit like. It helps these untold memories stay alive. And tell us, did Harrow do the right thing? Chapter 7. What remains relief arrived at 800 hours. The trucks came through the perimeter with supplies and fresh personnel and the news that Bastogne had held. The siege was broken. The winter was beginning to release its grip. And with the trucks came medical officers from higher command ready to assess the field hospital's operations during the siege and document everything. Colonel Vance presented them with Harrow's report. 32 cases of cold injury treated via rapid rewarming immersion, outcomes documented, no infections, minimal tissue loss, all patients surviving and mobile. The medical officers read it in silence. Then they read it again. This contradicts protocol, the senior officer said finally. Yes, sir, Vance replied. Captain Harrow developed the methodology in response to siege conditions that made standard amputation unsustainable. Unsustainable how? Unsustainable because if we'd followed protocol, 30 men would have lost hands that didn't need to be lost. Unsustainable because I'm not sure doctrine is always right, just because it's doctrine. The senior officer looked at Harrow. You developed this methodology? Or adopted it? I adapted it from European research, Harrow said. Dr. Steinberg in Vienna, the protocol was not approved by military authorities. No, the officer agreed. It wasn't. But 3 days later, as the hospital was being transitioned to permanent staffing and Harrow was preparing to be transferred out, a directive came down from command. All field medical personnel will review the Harrow cold injury protocol, effective immediately. Rapid rewarming immersion approved for frostbite assessment, with demarcation clarification required before amputation. This supersedes previous doctrine. It had taken a single surgeon choosing conscience over obedience, a chief nurse choosing documentation over silence, and a colonel choosing humanity over protocol. And it had taken the evidence of 30 men who still had fingers. Harrow visited Private Kowalski before he left Bastogne. The boy was in the transfer ward, his hands wrapped but functional, his future intact in ways that were tangible and countable. He could hold a cigarette, he could write his mother, he could, if the war ever ended, hold something that mattered beyond simply surviving. Thank you, sir, Kowalski said, when Harrow stopped by his bed. For what? For not giving up on us. Harrow didn't know how to answer that. He'd followed orders until he couldn't. He'd broken protocol when protocol was killing men unnecessarily. He'd risked everything on the belief that a surgeon's obligation to the body came before a soldier's obligation to doctrine. And he'd been right, which meant all the amputations he'd performed before, all the fingers he'd removed in obedience to protocol, had been unnecessary destruction. That knowledge would follow him beyond the war. It would sit in his hands every time he looked at a patient whose future he'd shaped by a decision to amputate or preserve. It would whisper in the distance between what was technically correct and what was humanly true. On the transport vehicle heading away from Bastogne, Harrow watched the town disappear into snow and distance. Somewhere behind him, 30 men were learning to live with hands they'd almost lost. Somewhere in a heated office, Colonel Vance was writing reports that explained how doctrine had failed and conscience had succeeded. Somewhere in a medical journal that would be read years after the war ended, Harrow's name would appear alongside Steinberg's, and the Vienna Protocol would be remembered not as forbidden research, but as the method that saved one Zirin fingers across a dozen sieges where the cold had tried to steal everything. But none of that was certain yet. All that was certain was this: he had made a choice when obedience demanded blindness. He had questioned authority when silence was safer, and he carried now the weight and the grace of knowing that some victories are measured not in battles won, but in fingers saved, in the future held in hands that were almost lost forever.